Why don't you check out all these really amazing people that we've been looking at in the Old Testament so far? Their stories, as they're coming together, start to give us a glimpse into God's big story for all of us. So today we know now that we're looking at Samson. And Samson was one of the judges. So in a moment we will hear a little bit more about the judges. But before we do, I just want to take us back to Moses. Because you remember that when Moses was in charge, all these amazing things happened. God parted the sea. He freed the Israelites from the slavery to the Egyptians in the most miraculous of ways. When Moses died, the next leader was Joshua. So before we got to Gideon, there was Joshua. And when Joshua was the leader, the people continued to obey God, to worship him, to follow him. But what happened when he died, in just a couple of generations, it was like the Israelites had forgotten who God was and everything he had done. And that's why the judges were needed. So let's find out about the judges.
So this is a little flowchart, if you like, of the different judges during the Israelites' history, and it shows the times when the Israelites had peace and when they had to be slaves to other nations. So here we go. The first judge that was raised up was Othniel, and there was peace from all the enemies for 40 years. However, when Othniel died, the Israelites rebelled and they ended up serving the king of Moab. So they were in slavery to the Moabites for 18 years. After 18 years, the people cried out to God, and he raised a leader called Ehud. Now, he's up here because he wasn't technically called a judge, but he was like a judge in the way he led, and there was peace when he was leading. After Ehud was the next judge, who was called Shamgar, and between these two, there was peace for 80 years. Now, when Ehud and Shamgar had both passed away, the Israelites did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord again. And this time, God made it that the Israelites ended up serving the king of Canaan for 20 years. It was pretty bad, so once again, the Israelites cried out to God. And again, he gave them a judge. This time, it was Deborah. While Deborah was judging the Israelites, there was peace for 40 years. Guess what? When Deborah died, the Israelites started to do what was evil in the eyes of the Lord again, and so he gave them over to the Midianites. For 7 years they were slaves to the Midianites. They cried out to God again, and along came Gideon. Now we've looked at Gideon and we know that he defeated the Midianites with that tiny army, remember, only 300? And after he defeated the Midianites, there was peace for the Israelites for another 40 years while Gideon was judge. But as soon as he died, you guessed it, the Israelites turned away from God again and worshipped other made-up gods. Now, after this, there was a guy called Abimelech who wanted to be king. So he got a bunch of people together on his side and killed anyone who might have got in his way or who didn't agree with him. And he made himself a leader. But he was never God's appointed leader, and so you can imagine that that didn't go too well. And so that's why he's down here on the bad side of the line. It certainly wasn't peaceful. After Abimelech was out of the way, there was a judge called Tola who judged for 23 years. After Tola, there was a judge called Jair, and he judged for 22 years. But again, as soon as Jair died, the Israelites turned away from God, and God let the Israelites get taken over by the Philistines and the Ammonites. So the Israelites were slaves to these two nations for 18 years. So of course, once again, the people cried out to God, who I'm surprised had not lost his patience by now. Do you notice how unfaithful the people of God were, time and time again? And God faithfully kept giving them a judge to rescue them. Anyway, after this, there was some fighting involved, and God's spirit came on a guy called Jephthah. He defeated the Ammonites and after some other fighting, judged Israel for 6 years before he died. The next judge was Ibzan, who judged Israel for 7 years. Then came Elon, who judged Israel for 10 years. And then Abdon, who was the judge for 8 years. But once again, as soon as the judge died, the people did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so God let the Philistines rule over them for 40 years. And it's here, in Judges chapter 13, that we hear of a woman who had a son called Samson, who became the judge of Israel for the last 20 years of those 40 years of slavery to the Philistines.
So it was Samson who finally saved the Israelites from those Philistines. And we're going to pop him on our board now. So we know that Gideon was one of the judges. He was in that little video. And Samson was our last judge. Because after him, no more judges were needed. And we know that Ruth's story happens in the period of the judges, doesn't it? So that's what we've got going on here. Now, I don't know if you noticed a pattern in what was happening with the judges, in that any time there was a judge ruling over Israel, the people honoured God and they worshipped him and they gave their lives wholeheartedly because they had that leader that they were listening to and following. But the second that the judge died, the people turned their backs on God and they stopped honouring God and they went their own way. And this is an age-old problem. I see it in myself even today. I think that the rules that God gives me sometimes aren't needed and I start to go my own way. Or maybe we think that the rules God gives us are restrictive. But that just shows that we don't really believe that God loves us and that we can trust his goodness, because his rules aren't there to contain and restrict and to prevent us from having life. His rules are there to give us freedom so that we can know him fully. We're going to be exploring this idea of rules and what it means to live under God's rule in both Recharge and Kids Church now. So Recharge in a moment are going to be heading upstairs to Chelsea Bay Lounge, and Kids Church are going to be heading downstairs to the basement. For those of you at home and the rest of you in the auditorium here, George is going to continue the I Believe series, taking us through the next part of the Apostles' Creed.